Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Climate Club, a community-driven platform building climate literacy, green skills, and responsible leadership across the UAE and wider GCC. Today, we're joined with Carolina. Carolina, so nice to meet you. Would you mind explaining a little bit for our audience about your background and what you're doing currently?
Sure. Very nice meeting you, everybody. I'm Carolina Proaño Castro. I'm based in Ecuador. I'm a climate and biodiversity professional with almost 20 years of experience. I've worked globally, but mostly in Latin America. Very nice meeting you.
And what's the initiative that you're currently working on the most related to biodiversity and nature value?
So currently I'm an executive director for Fundación Futuro. It's a private NGO based in Ecuador that is linked to a corporate group called the Grupo Futuro. So what we are implementing there is, let's say, a private carbon market where instead of buying traditional carbon credits, you pay for conservation efforts. And we've done that in the world of carbon. That would be called more like an insetting, but we call it ourselves. Those are high integrity a climate contribution with biodiversity impacts. So what we do is have like 21 companies that they have measured their emissions, they have a plan for reduction, and in order to neutralize their emissions, they pay for conservation efforts in highly biodiverse areas in the country.
Amazing. How did that initiative come about?
Um, well, a lot of ingredients for it to begin. So first, let's say the biggest shareholder of the holding group, it's a conservationist by nature and has been working in these issues for a very long time. So, despite of being a businessman and well recognized um, public figure in he's he's a biodiversity leader, and so that's the first thing. And then we had in Ecuador a regulatory framework that didn't allow us to play in the traditional voluntary carbon market. Our regulation didn't allow us to do that, but at the same time, all of the let's say private reserves and national parks are underfunded, as in many other countries in the world. So we had to find a way to use what we had in our favor. So basically, because it's a holding group that has 21 companies, we could work in corporate governance and have very clear guidelines on what should be done or what is the ideal of doing that as in a voluntary basis. So in that way, we could have enough funding flowing towards biodiversity efforts. And on the other side, we join with academia, where there's a lot of studies that usually are in peer review papers. Nobody really used that information. So with a local organization, with a lot of university in Ecuador, we've been developing a way of monitoring forests for the last 14 years already. So we have enough ground data, scientifically proven, that we could use to know exactly how much carbon, how much biodiversity those forests capture or hold or protect. And on the other way, we had the business that had to do that because of a corporate governance and a corporate guideline. So the match was perfect. So that's how it came about.
Amazing. And so what you're doing is around reframing nature as a digital, traceable, investable asset,
Mhm.
right? What inspired this approach?
Again, I think it was the regulatory restrictions.
Mm.
Innovation usually comes about restrictions. It's like we are not, for example, when I started running the organization, I used to live and work in the UK for the Global South program, so and anywhere, but mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the regulatory frameworks are very different in anywhere in the world. So in order to implement the Paris Agreement or the Montreal Agreement, you need local guidelines and not local policies that allow you to do that. In Ecuador, when I arrived, we have maybe 2 decades of delay in our climate policies in comparison to Colombia and Peru, for example. And at that moment, the traditional carbon market had already really bad reputation about double counting, about traceability, and about the real measurement of carbon capture. Those were the biggest, like say, problems in the carbon market. And in Ecuador, we didn't have any regulatory framework to work with. So the digital traceability mechanism arose as a response to that. So we said, okay, there's no regulatory framework that incentivize any of our business or any organization to do that. There's no carbon tax, there is no green taxonomy, there's not we're not allowed to play in the traditional carbon market, and we do have some of the most biodiverse forests in the world, and they are underfunded. So how do we do that? And then technology came in handy. So we said, okay, if we create a platform where on one side we have all the data. So we have done quite a lot of work in the science part, where we've developed models that could help us predict how much carbon and how much biodiversity those forests hold in a very, very huge area. Is 195,000 hectares. So that we use artificial intelligence, machine learning, a little bit of deep learning to create those models that are peer-reviewed and they are scientifically proven. So those maps that are amazing and those studies that are amazing were not available. Like nobody cares about that more than an organization that will certify your project. So we put those maps into a blockchain platform, and that blockchain platform allows you to sell tokens, and those tokens are bought by our companies. So our companies, they measure their emission, their reductions, and the amount that they want to buy. They buy a token. That token you pay on our platform with credit card or with direct wire, and that money goes into a trust fund, and that trust fund pays with a conservation agreement to the people and the landowners that are actually doing conservation action. So then you have the whole traceability in the financial side and the legal side, and we are not selling anything that isn't allowed to be sold in Ecuador because you are only transferring money towards like exchanging a token, like token for money, and a token could be anything. So it is under a regulatory framework, and then you actually pay the conservation action, and you don't have a lot of intermediaries that usually keep the money on the way. We provide 80% of the money to the local landowners, which nobody can. There's nobody in the world that has done that, and we can do that basically because we are an NGO, so we're not making profit out of it, and because we're using technology to ensure the traceability.
You're really solving the governance issue and building confidence in the market.
So that was the idea. But coming back to your question is that we had to create something that allowed us to play with those restrictions that we had in Ecuador.
Okay, interesting. And one of the questions we're exploring this month is kind of the price of nature, or the value of nature. So has this mechanism allowed you to really kind of put a price on biodiversity loss, and is that changing how businesses look at that decision and how they invest in the solution?
Yes and no, let's say. So we do have information about alpha biodiversity. So each token that you buy represent a number of pixels in a forest, and those number of pixels that are 10 per 10 have information about carbon stock, productivity, and alpha biodiversity. Alpha biodiversity means basically the amount of species that you can find in a specific location. That's all that it indicates. So you can just know which are the areas where more species are located and areas where you have less of that. So that's from the scientific point of view, and we figured that out. And that, again, not a lot of programs that offer to do that have manage to do that because biodiversity is difficult to measure everywhere, not only in Ecuador. And on the other side, we have our companies. They are forced to buy our token for corporate
Hmm.
governance. So there's
Okay.
not really need for our token or our system, and they don't really care about biodiversity because
Yeah.
like they are not buying it because of that, right? Like of course they understand, they are part of the group, it's part of the philosophy, but it's not that from a business model point of view or from a business model risk management perspective, they have to do that. One of our companies, yes. So we have a tourism company that is one of the biggest tourism companies in the region. And we have high-end eco lodge, 3 cruisers in the Galapagos. So they depend on biodiversity directly. So for
Mm.
them, without biodiversity, their eco lodge doesn't really value. So for them, it makes total sense from a PR perspective, from a branding perspective, from a risk management perspective. So for them, they are really happy that all the other companies are investing in conservation of that side. But
Yeah.
when then we have the biggest insurance company in the country, there's no direct dependency on biodiversity. They
Interesting.
understand it's important because
Yeah.
it will reduce risk in the long term, but it's so far away in their, let's say, supply chain that is absolutely not their needs. So yeah, it's not that straightforward.
Hmm. So those companies that are doing it out of obligation, the kind of corporate governance, do you think this is a sustainable thing in the long term? That at what point will you see a tipping point with more businesses, recognizing this as kind of critical to their not just their kind of business model, but beyond that, like to sustainability?
Well, we already reached, let's say, a threshold. Like outside our corporate group, it's very difficult to sell that because
Mm.
there's not a regulation that forced them to do it. So for me, the first thing that has to happen is local, uh, um, let's say, legislation that
Hmm.
it's not voluntary, because the moment it's voluntary, it's never going to happen, or it's going to happen in a very, very slow rhythm. So you need that locally. And on the other side, you need market incentives as well. So the problem is
Hmm.
that insurance are not aligned to that, banks are not aligned to that, international traders are not aligned. So even though there are some signs of global regulation, you know that now it's absolutely not the moment to think that that will work, like
Yeah.
geopolitically speaking, but that's really far away from local decision making. So, for example, Ecuador exports cocoa, coffee, palm oil, banana. Those are really
Yeah.
things that are for interest of international trading, and you can have those. For example, the European Union can say there's no banana that will enter the European Union that is zero deforestation. That's
Hmm.
nice to say, but who's going to pay for that? And the moment that the banana producers are going to actually do that biodiversity friendly with that, it's not going to happen in the short term. And especially now, there's not a clear panorama or who's paying for that. So the European consumer is not going to pay an extra price. The European Union will have a shortage of bananas and cocoa and coffee, and Latin America will sell those products to China, where there's no such restrictions, or India, right? So that's the reality of international trade. So even though there is this kind of regulations that aim to make it more mandatory in the supply chain,
Mm.
if you double click that, it's not really the case.
Mm.
And for example, in Ecuador, they rather sell the bananas to the region or to China
Mm.
than to pay for all of those new regulations or certifications for the EU, because there's not um, a premium price that actually will pay for all those things.
Yeah, yeah. So what in your mind needs to change for this to become normalized globally?
I think, well, I think we need to understand that it's a transition, as in any of those topics, like sustainability is a transition, energy transition is a transition. And we use the word transition a lot, but we don't understand what does actually mean. So transition needs, everybody has to pay for that transition. And there's a lot of enabling conditions that has to happen along the way for that. So um, coming back to the biodiversity regulations in the European Union, what should happen and already happened is like you need to phase out the transition. Like you need to have a timeline, and in that timeline all of the different stakeholders need to be on board and need to pay a portion of that, because if not, it's not going to happen. And I think the idea that international law will have that local impact, it's it's very naive. It's very naive, and I've seen it in my country. You know, it's like, yeah, you aspire to sell your banana to European Union, but if it's so expensive, you won't do it. Not because you are a bad person or because you don't care about the environment or biodiversity. Don't have the means to pay for the transition, and
Yeah.
at the moment the transition is all of for biodiversity is all in the producers or in the biodiversity rich countries such as Ecuador, where we face very difficult trade-offs to maintain biodiversity. So we are rich in biodiversity, rich in critical minerals for energy transition, and we have oil. Yeah. So you have a piece of
Yeah.
land, a small piece of land, and you have to choose which are the land use that you will do it. Or you will
Mm.
have organic bananas for the European Union, or you will sell your critical minerals for energy transition, or you sell your oil. So, and you need the money to develop. So which of the three trades of are you going to use it? And usually what's happening is it's very easy to mine, it's very easy to extract oil, and it's very difficult to transition to
Mm.
anything that is biodiversity friendly. The incentives are not there, and
Yeah.
that is the real problem, because you have
Yeah.
all the perverse incentives in oil and mining, and you don't
Mm.
have the same level of incentives in agriculture, for example. So
Mm.
I think that is, coming back to your question, is like, what could we do as fix on that, like in the
Mm.
incentives. We talked that for $1 that we invest in conservation of biodiversity, you will use 34 to harm biodiversity. That's the
Mm.
reality nowadays. And it's really depressing, because it's like, doesn't matter if you invest $1 in conservation if those other 34 are invested in damaging, and damaging usually is extractive industry, infrastructure, etc., which I'm not against, but
Mhm.
it's not fair. You're not playing in the same field.
Yeah, there is a big trade-off there, I guess. And yeah, what about the financial markets? Is there anything we can do? You mentioned like incentivizing. What do you see as the role there? And I guess what's your tool doing to shape that as well?
Yes. So in the financial markets, there are small baby steps happening.
Uh-huh.
And the problem with that is how you measure biodiversity. So there is an appetite of risk. You know, we've been developing carbon markets for like 50 years, and they're still not working, and everything is a mess. Biodiversity is even more difficult because
Yeah.
what's more valuable, like an Andean bear or the gray bear, or an elephant? It's very difficult to actually measure what's valuable in biodiversity and what's not. There are ways, there are methodologies, uh, but they are not exact everywhere. So I don't know, in the area of the world where you live, I would say naively that biodiversity is not necessarily your biggest asset. In
Mhm.
my country, yes, it is. But does it make it more valuable? I don't know if you have a butterfly that are butterfly. So it becomes difficult. And that difficulty of biodiversity and the ecological systems per se scares the finance world. And
Mm.
the finance world, so they are willing to, they've done really big steps, right, trying to do that, nature, like debt swaps for nature, and a lot of other mechanisms that are already happening. And the moment they don't know how to measure, it becomes tricky because the money is there or could be there. And then how do you measure impact in biodiversity is tricky. So that is
Mhm.
where we're trying to solve that. And what we've done in our methodology is trying to I don't know, like give some lights in that sense. Um, but I think we're still speaking different languages. So I've seen some of the British banks hiring experts in biodiversity in the last 3 years,
Yes, I
not
saw that too.
before. Before
Mm.
there wasn't such thing.
Yeah.
I've been, like working in that area 20 years, and there was no bank that would like to hire me 20 years or 15 years ago. But yeah, you have the big British banks already opening those positions because they need somebody speaking the language to be
Mhm.
able to do those financial products. So I think we are going closer to that. And yeah, my suggestion would be to be a lot more pragmatic, for example, and not and do not fall into the very, very technical measurements such as carbon that has taken us years. Because in conservation, if you protect the land and the threats for changing that land use, that's good enough. Whoever lives whoever lives in that piece of land, if there are frogs or whatever, they will be fine. Like if you stop threatening with land use change, they will thrive. They don't need much,
Yeah.
but we don't need to measure exactly how many of
Uh-huh.
them will leave or how much pollination has increased. It's like let nature do what he knows how to do, and you
Yeah.
ensure that some areas are no-go zones, no area, and others that you can have sustainable use. Having those, and we
Mhm.
already have those methodologies like worldwide.
So do you think that COP30, sorry, being hosted in Brazil has that changed anything? Because obviously Brazil with the Amazon rainforest and there was a big focus on nature. Has it kind of helped or hindered the conversation around this?
Well, yes and no. Let's say the good thing about Belém was that it was for the first time in history, the two COPs, the COP for nature and COP for climate, has come together. And for me, that was
Hmm.
like about time, right? Like, because what was happening is the climate agenda was threatening the biodiversity agenda, which makes absolutely no sense, especially with mining for critical minerals for energy transition. So we were, although of everybody was just hoping to transition in energy, and we were literally mining the most biodiverse areas in the world, and we want to mine the ocean, etc. So that was a complete disaster, and the two cops were discussing in parallel, like no, they weren't talking together. So the great thing was that it was the first time the two agendas came together, and they discussed about those trade-offs. So, okay, we want energy transition to what, at what cost?
Hmm.
Do we need mining? Yes. Where? And where we cannot mine, and why? Because it's an agenda of resilience. So it's the first time that that has happened. And that was prior Trump destroys everything. And the thing
Mm.
is that the cops are a reflection of geopolitics, and we are in the worst moment of geopolitics,
Yeah.
of multilateralism, international law, and that makes it tricky, and how those treaties will be enforced. Because if you don't have the big polluters on board, that's China and the US, nobody will do their part. Ecuador, we can do anything we want, everything, or everything we can, but we're so small that you won't change the course of anything. So
Yeah.
if you don't have United States and China on board, those negotiations are useless, like at the global level. I
Yeah.
mean, like, we
Do you
can
feel
all do
like
a little bit.
do you feel like the US's kind of change of direction has thwarted efforts around your work? Or are you seeing companies reinvest because they want to double down on this now that you know,
So
to prove the
I
point?
think what Trump is doing is changing the narrative to his
Yeah.
benefit. and
Yeah.
so my lessons to that is like we need to work domestically and do whatever we can where we are, because those international, let's say, scenarios or conditions are out of our hands, and we
Mhm.
have to kind of like navigate that, but still we need to finance nature. So we still need to find ways to finance. And when you innovate at the local level or at a national level, it's more likely that you are innovative than if you do that at the global level, even if it doesn't scale, right? Even if it doesn't scale, that already is saving enough land. But yeah, I think things will get trickier depending on each economy and how these economies depends on the US. That will be
Yeah.
more and less, let's say, will affect more and less. I haven't seen in Ecuador our like companies outside our corporate group saying, yeah, because of Trump, let's invest more in that. We have other problems. We have drug dealers in like organized crime. No, we have a lot of huge problems where biodiversity is
Yeah.
not necessarily a priority.
Yeah. I mean, globally, it feels like that's also the way that the narrative is going, cost of living rising, inequality, these things seem to be dominating the headlines now, of people facing much more immediate pressures, and the kind of idea of, nature seems remote from a lot of people as well, who are like living in cities and, not always so connected. So yeah, how do we bring the conversation back, I guess, to nature?
I think mainstreaming that conversation into risk management. That's
Mm,
in resilience. That's it. It's
yeah.
like you don't have to talk about any beautiful frog or animal. Is that it's resilience and it's
Yeah.
water,
Yeah.
it's soil fertility, it's fertilization and food security. So if you
Mhm.
make biodiversity a security issue, and so
Yeah.
we will be in the agenda, and that's very possible. So
Yeah.
that's the way. So we, like, people working in biodiversity should stop talking about how beautiful biodiversity is, but
Yeah.
uh, mainstream that in showing that without that there are more risk, there is less
Yeah.
food, there's less water,
Yeah.
and that's actually real true. Like, we're not inventing the wheel, but
Yeah.
that would be my suggestion. So because at least, let's say, at least the next 5 years, we will have to, same with sustainability, we will have to stop talking about those topics with that headline, but we'll
Mhm.
still have to move the agenda with or using other words and being at the table with other stakeholders.
Yeah. Yeah. Which sectors and which other regions as well, besides Ecuador, do you see most at risk of these problems related to nature?
Well, related to nature, Latin America for sure. It's not only Ecuador, the whole region. We hold 53% of the global forest and 43% of the global biodiversity, terrestrial biodiversity. So the whole region is at risk. But on the other, it will be the Southeast Asian uh,
Mhm.
part, because every single high biodiverse area has critical minerals underneath.
So, Carolina, which sectors and which regions as well of the world do you see most at risk of nature?
Well, I would say globally in general, because nature has a value everywhere. However, the areas of the world where there's more biodiversity concentrated, such as Latin America, the Southeast Asia, certain parts of Africa, Europe. So I think nature, I think it's necessarily and valuable everywhere, and
Yeah.
not necessarily in relation to biodiversity per se, because biodiversity is another thing, right? Like that it's how many species and how many and specific species you find somewhere else. But the functioning of nature or ecosystems properly, I think it's needed everywhere.
Mm.
Um, Especially linked, I will say, to soil health and water production. Those are the two big, say, ecosystem functions that globally need to be maintained.
Yeah, I mean, we're very far from you right now, right? We're on the other side of the world, in fact. But these conversations are appearing, and we're in a region that's traditionally seen as not very biodiverse, right? We're in a desert, but at the same time we have water scarcity, which you mentioned. Food security is a big issue as well. So it's good to see that these conversations are coming here. But I guess what can we do to connect, your world in Ecuador in like the most biodiverse region on the planet with us over here? How can we help companies to understand that these two places are interconnected?
I think it will be in the way ecosystems function, because that's the thing. The thing is that every human being, we have the exact same needs. So we need nutritious food because we don't just need food. We need water, and water scarcity is everywhere in the world. Like even in the biggest in the areas such as Latin America, where we have a lot of water, there are water scarcity in big cities like Mexico and in Santiago in Chile and other big cities that are already facing that. So I think the conversation, as you said, just to unite different regions despite of the characteristic of ecosystems, is what do we need as humans, right? And it's very basic. It's clean
Mm.
air, clean water, healthy soils. That's
Hmm.
the bare minimum, let's
Yeah.
say. And then you need aesthetics and beauty or whatever you want, like landscape. But a desert that I've never been to, I'm pretty sure it's stunning too. It's totally a different thing. But
Yeah.
you still need to eat and you still need water to survive. So I think those are the
Yeah.
conversations that definitely um, nexus. And that's a triangle that brings everybody on board, and it's a national security issue. So if a
Mm.
country doesn't have water, they will go into war for it, right? Like, and if you don't have energy, is exactly the same, and if you don't have food, is the same. So those three elements are key for making nature, let's say, a primary need in every political agenda. And
Mm.
if we manage to make it a national security issue, I think we will win. That's where most of the budget is going anyway.
I mean, that's just what came out of the UK, right? Where they just did the strategy around the risk that nature faces to the country politically, economically, etc. So more countries, I guess, need to do that analysis and really, understand the long-term sustainability and importance of nature to their country.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today. And it was really fascinating to learn about everything you're doing. And congratulations on the amazing tool. I hope it sees a lot of success in the future as well.
Thank you, Marianne. Very nice meeting you, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, wonderful.
Ciao,
Thank
ciao.
you. Bye.